April 2021 arrived cold in Grant County, Wisconsin, long after the maple buds should have opened. Frost still clung to the fence posts each morning, and every pickup that rolled past the Miller farm slowed just enough for its driver to stare. At sunrise, 21-year-old Hannah Miller was unloading white plastic transport crates from an aging livestock trailer. Inside them, hundreds of tiny pink noses pressed against the wire lids. 500 albino mice. People laughed before they even counted them. "They're giving away pests now?" someone shouted from across the gravel road. Another man removed his cap, shook his head, and laughed hard enough to cough. "Your mama left you mice instead of money?" Hannah didn't answer. She simply tightened the strap around another crate and carried it toward the old dairy barn that had stood on the property since 1938. Her boots sank into the muddy yard. The sleeves of her faded canvas work jacket were already stained with feed dust before breakfast. 3 weeks earlier, her mother had died after a short illness. She hadn't left savings. She hadn't left machinery worth selling. She hadn't even left enough money to pay the spring property taxes. Instead, tucked inside a folder beside the will, was a handwritten sentence. "The mice aren't the inheritance. They're the beginning." No explanation. Just those words. Everyone assumed grief had clouded her mother's judgment during her final weeks. Hannah wasn't sure they were wrong. The farm's small dairy herd had already been sold to cover medical bills. The cornfields were leased. The hay barn leaked. The old John Deere 4020 tractor still started every morning, but only after a cloud of blue smoke and several patient turns of the key. Debt had become the loudest sound on the farm. Then the trailer arrived. The mice came from a laboratory breeding facility nearly 80 miles away that had unexpectedly closed after losing its federal contracts. Most breeders refused to take them. Animal rescues didn't have space. Pet stores couldn't absorb hundreds of genetically identical albino mice. Someone remembered Hannah's mother. Years earlier, before illness slowed her down, she'd occasionally cared for surplus research animals until new homes could be found. That single favor was enough. When the facility closed, the call came. 500 mice. Free. Including the cages. The timing couldn't have been worse. Or stranger. By noon, half the county had heard. Neighbors parked along the roadside pretending to check fences while watching Hannah unload crate after crate. Children counted them. Teenagers recorded videos. One clip reached thousands of local views before sunset. "Farm girl inherits rats." The comments were cruel. Nobody bothered correcting them. Albino mice looked ridiculous against the backdrop of Wisconsin farmland. What use could they possibly have? Even Hannah asked herself that question every night. She spread fresh bedding. Checked every water bottle. Measured feed with an old kitchen scale. 500 tiny lives depended on someone who could barely afford groceries herself. Still, she noticed something odd before the first week ended. Every morning, the mice became unusually active at almost the exact same time. Not sunrise. Not feeding time. Roughly 40 minutes before the old oak behind the barn cast its shadow across the windows. The pattern repeated. Exactly. She wrote it inside a weather notebook her mother once used to record rainfall. Most people would have ignored it. Hannah didn't. Her mother had taught her one rule. Nature repeats itself before it explains itself. So she kept watching. A few days later, Wayne Crawford, the county agricultural loan officer, pulled into the driveway wearing polished boots that had probably never stepped into manure. He walked through the empty cattle barn before entering the converted mouse room. His eyebrows climbed higher with every shelf. "You can't be serious." Hannah continued filling feed trays. "I'm trying." Wayne laughed softly. "You owe the bank nearly $80,000. "I know. You've replaced dairy cattle with laboratory mice. They needed somewhere. They won't save this farm." He paused. "In fact, they may be the fastest way I've ever seen someone lose one." Before leaving, he handed her another envelope. "Payment due. 30 days. After that, foreclosure proceedings would begin." He wasn't cruel about it. Just certain. When his truck disappeared down the road, Hannah folded the notice without opening it again. Instead, she returned to the barn. One mouse sat perfectly still while every other mouse moved around it. Not sick. Not sleeping. Watching. Its pink eyes followed a narrow beam of afternoon sunlight creeping across the floorboards. When the sunlight shifted, the mouse moved exactly with it. The next day another did the same. Then 5. Then dozens. She marked the times. The pattern matched changing daylight instead of feeding schedules. It didn't make sense. Why would laboratory mice, raised indoors for generations, react so precisely to natural light? She called the only person she thought might know. Old Walter Briggs answered after 6 rings. Walter had retired from managing a university greenhouse decades earlier. Most people in Grant County knew him as the quiet man who repaired antique seed drills for neighbors without charging them. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked only one question. "Did your mother tell you where those breeding lines originally came from?" "I don't think so." Walter became silent. Long enough that Hannah wondered if the call had dropped. Finally he spoke. "Don't sell a single mouse." "Why?" "Because if I'm remembering correctly." He stopped. "I'll drive over tomorrow." The line went dead. Rain arrived overnight. Not a thunderstorm. Just a slow, soaking rain that darkened the fields until they almost looked black. Inside the barn, every mouse became unusually quiet. Except one. It stood on its hind legs facing the north wall, scratching gently at the wire as though it could hear something hidden beyond the wood. Hannah walked over. The scratching stopped. She looked through the narrow window toward the old maple windbreak behind the barn. Nothing moved. Then she noticed something she had never seen before. A thin black cable disappeared underground beside the foundation. By first light the rain had stopped, but the ground around the barn still held yesterday's footprints. Hannah carried 2 buckets of fresh bedding inside, yet her attention stayed fixed on the thin black cable disappearing beneath the foundation. She could not remember seeing it before. The barn had belonged to her family for 3 generations. She knew every cracked board and every loose hinge. Not that cable. She knelt beside it, brushed away damp soil with a gloved hand, and discovered it wasn't modern at all. The rubber insulation had hardened with age. Moss had nearly swallowed it. Someone had buried it decades earlier. The mice behind her suddenly erupted into movement. Not panic. Excitement. Hundreds of tiny feet rustled across bedding at once. They were all facing the same direction. Toward the north wall. Hannah slowly stood. "All right," she whispered. "What are you trying to tell me?" Walter Briggs arrived just after 9 in a faded green pickup that looked almost as old as the barn itself. He stepped out carrying no tools, only a weathered leather notebook. Without greeting he walked straight into the converted mouse room. He didn't look at Hannah. He looked at the mice. Then he quietly removed his cap. "I haven't seen this breeding line in almost 30 years. You recognize them?" "I recognize their ears." Hannah frowned. "Their ears?" Walter pointed toward one of the cages. "Look closely." She did. Each mouse had tiny identification tattoos inside one ear. Numbers so small she had mistaken them for freckles. Walter nodded. "I thought so." "You know what they mean?" "I helped install one of the original controlled breeding colonies at the University of Wisconsin in the early 90s. Hannah blinked. "These came from there?" "Not directly." Walter opened his notebook. "They're descendants." He traced an old handwritten entry with one finger. "Your mother volunteered there one summer before you were born." Hannah stared. "My mother never told me." "No." Walter smiled sadly. "She wasn't the type to tell people the important things. She preferred showing them." He looked around the barn one more time. "Did she leave you any paperwork besides the will?" "Only feeding schedules." "No letters?" Hannah hesitated. "There was one envelope." "You opened it?" "No." Walter looked directly at her. "Open it tonight." News of Walter's visit spread through the county before lunchtime. Nobody knew what they had discussed. That only fueled the rumors. At Miller Feed and Supply, 3 farmers leaned against seed pallets drinking coffee. "I heard some professor drove out there. Maybe he's buying those mice." "For what?" The oldest man laughed. "Maybe the circus." Across town, Hannah's phone buzzed with another notification. Someone had uploaded another video. This one showed her carrying cages through the mud. The caption read, "Future millionaire, because of mice." Thousands laughed. She turned the phone off. There were chores to finish. Mockery never cleaned water bottles. That afternoon she hitched the old John Deere 4020 to a manure spreader she now used for hauling sawdust instead. The tractor coughed twice before settling into its familiar rumble. Her grandfather used to say machines remembered the hands that respected them. Hannah believed it. She drove slowly toward a nearby sawmill where hardwood shavings could still be bought cheaply. Halfway there the engine stumbled. Then died. She coasted onto the roadside. Steam drifted lazily from beneath the hood. Not overheating. Fuel. She climbed down. The sediment bowl beneath the fuel tank had nearly filled with rust flakes. She cleaned it with a pocket knife, exactly as her grandfather had taught her. 20 minutes later the tractor started on the first turn. Sometimes old machines didn't need replacing. They needed patience. Walter's words echoed in her mind. Open the envelope tonight. By evening another mystery appeared. While changing bedding, Hannah noticed something impossible. 3 cages had noticeably less feed remaining than the others. She checked her notebook. Every cage received the exact same amount each morning. She weighed the leftovers. The difference was real. The mice weren't eating equally. Certain family lines consistently consumed less food. Yet those same mice were more active. She repeated the measurements. Again. The pattern held. Instead of ignoring it, she wrote everything down. Feed weight, water use, temperature, humidity, sunrise, sunset. Her mother had always said notebooks solved problems long before opinions did. There is something remarkable about laboratory mice that most people never think about. Generations of careful breeding make many research mice genetically almost identical. That allows scientists to study whether a treatment truly causes a change instead of wondering whether 2 different animals simply inherited different traits. Tiny differences in food intake, activity, or behavior become valuable clues because genetics remain so consistent. Hannah didn't fully understand the science. She only understood patterns. And patterns rarely lied. That night she finally opened the sealed envelope. Inside rested a folded county map. Nothing else. No letter. No explanation. Across the map someone had circled one corner of the property in faded blue ink. The Old North Pasture. Beside it her mother's handwriting read only 6 words. Start where the spring once flowed. Hannah frowned. There hadn't been a spring on the farm in decades. Had there? She spread the map across the kitchen table. An older memory surfaced. When she was 7, she'd followed her grandfather beyond the windbreak. He had pointed toward a patch of wild sedges. There used to be water here. She had forgotten. Until now. Morning arrived with thick fog rolling through the valleys. Instead of beginning chores, Hannah walked toward the abandoned north pasture carrying nothing but a shovel. The grass reached nearly to her knees. Wild sumac had swallowed sections of the old fence. Near the center of the field she found the exact place marked on the map. Nothing remained except uneven ground. She pushed the shovel into the earth. 6 inches down. Wet soil. Another foot. Dark clay. Then, clink. Metal. Not rock. Metal. She cleared more dirt until a rusted iron lid emerged from beneath decades of roots. Stamped across the top were nearly invisible words. Property of the University of Wisconsin. Her heartbeat quickened. What was university equipment doing beneath her family's pasture? Before she could pry the lid open, a pickup truck rolled across the field. Wayne Crawford climbed out. He looked from the shovel, to the buried iron cover, to Hannah. What exactly are you digging up? She hadn't told anyone about the map. So how had he known where to find her? And then she noticed another truck waiting silently at the gate. It carried government plates. The second truck stayed parked beside the broken gate for nearly a minute before its engine fell silent. No one climbed out. Wayne Crawford kept his eyes on the rusted iron cover. You should probably step away from that, he said. Hannah rested both hands on the shovel. Why? I received a phone call this morning. From who? I wasn't told much. He glanced toward the government truck. Only that someone was coming to inspect your property. The driver's door finally opened. A woman in a tan field jacket stepped onto the wet pasture carrying a hard plastic case instead of a clipboard. Mud collected on her boots within 3 steps, yet she didn't seem bothered. She stopped beside the iron cover. I'm Dr. Elise Morgan, she said. United States Department of Agriculture. She didn't offer a handshake. She crouched beside the lid instead. Did you uncover this today? Hannah nodded. My mother left me a map. Dr. Morgan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. A map. Hannah unfolded the Warren County map and handed it over. The scientist studied the handwriting for several seconds. I was hoping this had been lost. You know what this is? I know what it might be. Wayne frowned. Someone want to tell me what's happening? Dr. Morgan looked at him calmly. Not until we know whether this chamber is intact. It took nearly 20 minutes to free the rusted bolts. Walter Briggs arrived halfway through, breathing harder than usual after hurrying across the uneven field. The moment he saw the government truck, he stopped. I was afraid of this. You've been here before? Hannah asked. Walter nodded slowly. Long ago. Dr. Morgan looked at him with surprise. Walter Briggs? It's been a while. You helped build this site. I helped bury it. Silence settled over the pasture. Even Wayne seemed unsure whether to interrupt. Walter finally spoke. In 1992 this farm participated in a small agricultural research project. My family? Hannah asked. Your grandfather volunteered. For what? Walter rested one weathered hand on the iron lid. To study how healthy farm ecosystems naturally reduce disease-carrying rodents. Hannah blinked. I don't understand. The researchers weren't trying to breed mice here. They were trying to understand them. The heavy lid finally lifted. Cool air escaped from the chamber beneath. Not foul. Not stale. Cool. A narrow concrete staircase disappeared underground. Hannah switched on a flashlight. The beam revealed shelves, old electrical conduits, steel cabinets, and something else. The cable. The same black cable the mice had been staring toward inside the barn. It ran directly into the underground room. Dr. Morgan smiled for the first time. So that's where it went. Walter looked almost relieved. They never removed it. What is it? Hannah asked. Environmental monitoring. He pointed toward the walls. Sensors. Still working? They shouldn't be. Dr. Morgan carefully opened one cabinet. Inside sat rows of sealed notebooks protected inside waterproof containers. Perfectly dry. She lifted one out. Across the cover someone had written. Grant County Field Colony. April 1992. Below that, Miller Farm. Hannah swallowed. Her family's name had been sitting beneath the pasture for almost 30 years. Waiting. Back in the barn Hannah could think of little else. The mice behaved exactly as they always had. Drinking, climbing, sleeping. Yet somehow they now felt connected to something much larger. She opened one of the recovered notebooks. Instead of complicated scientific language, most pages contained simple observations. Temperature, humidity, sunrise, predator sightings, owl activity, fox tracks, hawk nests, snake populations, and mice. Thousands of handwritten entries. Walter noticed Hannah's confusion. The scientists eventually realized something. What? The healthiest mouse colonies weren't determined only by genetics. They depended on the entire surrounding ecosystem. He tapped the page showing owl nesting dates. Remove predators. He turned another page. Rodent behavior changes. Another page. Vegetation changes. Another. Disease pressure changes. It was all connected. Walter smiled. Nature rarely works alone. Outside, the county gossip had already transformed. Nobody was laughing anymore. Now people were curious. Cars slowed along the road. Drones appeared overhead. Someone claimed federal agents had discovered buried government property. Another insisted toxic waste had been found. By evening a local television crew parked beside the mailbox. Hannah ignored them. The mice still needed feeding. Late that night she noticed another pattern. Several mice consistently built their nests against the northern side of each enclosure. Not randomly. Almost every time. She rotated one cage 180 degrees. The next morning the nest had been rebuilt, again facing north. She repeated the experiment. Same result. 20 cages. Same result. She mentioned it to Dr. Morgan. The scientist became unusually quiet. You've confirmed it. Confirmed what? They still have it. Have what? Orientation. I don't understand. Most mammals possess tiny biological mechanisms that help them sense Earth's magnetic field, although scientists are still studying exactly how it works. It's subtle, but some animals consistently build nests or rest in preferred directions under controlled conditions. You think that's what they're doing? I think they're telling us something. Wayne returned 3 days later. This time without foreclosure papers. He carried coffee instead. I owe you an apology. Hannah looked up from cleaning cages. For laughing. You weren't the only one. No. But I was supposed to know better. He set the coffee on a workbench. I've been talking with the USDA team. And? They're impressed. They've only been here 3 days. Wayne smiled. They aren't impressed by the mice. He paused. They're impressed by your records. She looked toward the shelves filled with notebooks. Every feeding. Every weather change. Every unusual behavior. Every observation. Nothing skipped. Wayne shook his head. Most operations with 10 times your budget don't keep records that carefully. Hannah simply shrugged. My mother always wrote things down. 1 week later Dr. Morgan requested permission to collect a handful of environmental samples from the farm. Soil. Water. Air filters. Feed. Everything tested clean. Cleaner than expected. Exceptionally clean. Then another surprise arrived. The mice were clean as well. Not merely healthy. Remarkably free of the common microorganisms normally found even in carefully managed colonies. Dr. Morgan reread the laboratory report twice. This shouldn't be possible. Walter folded his arms. What are we missing? She looked toward the north pasture. I think we've been asking the wrong question. What question? We keep asking why the mice are different. She pointed toward the surrounding hills. The better question is, what makes this entire farm different? That afternoon Hannah walked toward the old windbreak alone. The breeze carried the smell of damp earth and emerging maple leaves. She stopped near the forgotten spring marked on her mother's map. Water. She heard it. Not much. Just a faint trickle beneath the ground. Then she noticed fresh soil piled beside a small opening hidden under tangled roots. Something had been digging there. It wasn't a fox. The tracks were too small. She knelt for a closer look. And suddenly realized she wasn't looking at one set of tiny footprints. There were hundreds. Hannah brushed away the loose leaves with the back of her glove. The tiny tracks crisscrossed the damp soil like threads in an old quilt. They led toward the hidden spring, disappeared beneath exposed maple roots, and emerged again a few feet away. They were far too numerous to belong to a single animal. Walter arrived a few minutes later, walking more slowly than usual. You found it. I found tracks. Walter knelt beside her. No, he said quietly. You found the reason your grandfather never filled this spring. The trickle of water was barely visible beneath the roots. It wasn't enough to irrigate a field, but it never stopped moving. Dr. Morgan collected a small sample in a sterile bottle. We'll test it. For contamination? Hannah asked. For everything. 3 days later the laboratory results arrived. The spring water was unusually stable year-round because it flowed through deep limestone beneath the rolling hills of Grant County before emerging at the surface. It remained naturally cool, low in dissolved contaminants, and remarkably consistent in mineral balance. By itself, that wasn't extraordinary. But when Dr. Morgan compared decades of rainfall records, vegetation surveys, owl nesting reports, and Hannah's notebooks, another pattern emerged. The abandoned north pasture had quietly rebuilt itself. Native grasses had returned after cattle stopped grazing there. Owls nested in the windbreak every spring. Foxes hunted the surrounding fields. Hawks circled the open meadow. Snakes sheltered beneath old stone piles. Each predator naturally reduced wild rodent populations carrying common pathogens. The untouched spring supported insects, wildflowers, and healthy soil organisms. The ecosystem had slowly balanced itself. The laboratory mice inside the barn had never been isolated from nature. They had been protected by it. Dr. Morgan looked at Hannah. Most facilities try to control everything. She smiled. Your farm remembered how not to. The news spread much faster this time. Not because of gossip. Because the USDA published preliminary findings describing the property as an unusually healthy agricultural environment worthy of long-term ecological study. Universities began calling. Veterinary schools requested visits. Research institutions asked careful questions. No one asked to buy the farm. They asked whether Hannah would consider breeding small numbers of pathogen-monitored research mice under strict ethical standards. The irony wasn't lost on Wayne Crawford. Only weeks earlier he had predicted the mice would end the farm. Now waiting lists were forming. Hannah refused the first 6 offers. Walter wasn't surprised. You don't trust them yet. I don't trust anyone who only sees dollar signs. So what do you see? She looked across the pasture where swallows skimmed low over the grass. I see responsibility. Walter nodded. Good answer. Instead of expanding as quickly as possible, Hannah accepted one partnership with a university research program that emphasized animal welfare, transparent oversight, and limited breeding. The colony remained small. Every enclosure exceeded recommended space requirements. Natural daylight cycles were carefully managed. Environmental records continued every single day. Nothing was rushed. That autumn, the county hosted its annual agricultural fair. For years Hannah had attended quietly. This year she almost stayed home. Walter insisted she go. You've hidden behind work long enough. Near the exhibition hall she noticed familiar faces. Some were the same neighbors who had laughed when the trailer full of white mice first arrived. Their expressions had changed. An older farmer removed his cap. I owe you an apology. Another woman smiled awkwardly. We thought your mother had lost her mind. Hannah simply nodded. There wasn't much else to say. Then Wayne stepped onto the small presentation stage. I'd like everyone to meet someone who reminded this county that observation matters more than assumptions." The audience applauded. Hannah looked down at her worn boots instead of toward the crowd. She had never wanted attention. Only another season on the farm. Winter settled over Wisconsin with heavy snow and long blue evenings. Inside the barn, warm lights glowed above carefully maintained colonies. The mice remained calm, healthy, predictable. Visitors often expected expensive technology to explain everything. Instead they found notebooks. Shelves filled with handwritten observations stretching back years. Weather, feed, water, behavior, questions, answers, and more questions. Dr. Morgan laughed the first time she saw them all. "This may be the most valuable equipment on the farm." Hannah smiled. "The notebooks." "No." She pointed toward Hannah herself. "The person willing to fill them." One quiet evening Walter handed Hannah the final notebook recovered from the underground chamber. A folded photograph slipped onto the table. It showed her grandfather standing beside a much younger Walter and several university researchers. In the background stood Hannah's mother, barely 20 years old, carrying a small white mouse in both hands. Written across the back were 8 simple words. "Some land doesn't need saving. It needs remembering." Hannah traced the handwriting with one finger. She finally understood. Her mother had never expected the mice themselves to make the farm valuable. They were simply the thread leading someone back to everything the land had quietly preserved. The inheritance had never been 500 white mice. It had been curiosity. 5 years later, visitors traveled from across the United States to the Miller Farm Ecological Research Cooperative. The restored north pasture remained untouched except for narrow walking paths. The spring flowed as steadily as ever. University students learned how biodiversity, healthy soils, predators, clean water, and careful observation could strengthen responsible agriculture. The old underground research room became a small museum preserving notebooks from both generations. Walter's leather notebook rested in a glass case near the entrance. A brass plaque beneath it read, "Every answer began as an observation." Wayne Crawford no longer arrived with foreclosure notices. He served on the cooperative's advisory board, helping young farmers find financing for conservation projects instead of encouraging them to abandon them. Whenever visitors asked about the beginning of the story, he always admitted the same thing. "I laughed first." Then he smiled. "I'm grateful she didn't listen." 10 years after the trailer arrived, children visiting the farm often stopped in front of an old photograph hanging inside the education center. It showed a young woman standing in muddy boots outside a weathered dairy barn. In her arms rested a single white mouse. Behind her stretched row after row of simple cages. The expression on her face wasn't triumph. It was determination. The guide would always ask the children the same question. "What do you think everyone saw?" Most answered the same way. "Mice." Then the guide would ask another. "What did Hannah see?" The room usually became quiet. Finally someone would answer. "A chance." On cool April mornings, the old John Deere 4020 still started after one steady turn of the key. Its familiar engine echoed across fields now bordered by native prairie flowers instead of bare fence lines. Owls returned each spring to the same windbreak. The hidden limestone spring continued its patient journey beneath the roots. Inside the barn, descendants of those original white mice lived under careful stewardship, contributing to research that improved both veterinary and human medicine while being raised under rigorous welfare standards. As dawn spread across the hills, Hannah paused outside the barn with a notebook tucked beneath one arm. Mist drifted gently over the pasture. A meadowlark sang from an old fence post. The spring whispered beneath the maples exactly as it always had. And for the first time in many years, the farm sounded completely at peace.